Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the sparring arena, watching the alien warriors move like dancers made of lightning. The ship's training deck was huge, bigger than 3 football fields back on Earth, and it hummed with the sound of energy. Weapons cutting through the air. Blue and purple lights flashed as the Zephyrian soldiers practiced their combat moves. Their forearms moving so fast they looked like a blur. The human captain kept his hands behind his back, trying to look calm, even though his heart was beating fast. He had been in plenty of fights before, but nothing like this. These aliens were 7 feet tall, covered in armor that looked like it was made from liquid starlight, and they moved with a grace that made human athletes look clumsy. Jake's eyes followed one warrior in particular. Commander Zarathul was the leader of the Zephyrian combat unit, and she was putting on quite a show. Her forearms wielded energy blades that could slice through steel like butter, and her armor changed colors as she moved, shifting from silver to gold to deep blue. Every strike she made left glowing marks in the air that took several seconds to fade away. The other human crew members stood nearby, watching with wide eyes. Lieutenant Lisa Chang was trying to hide her nervousness, but Jake could see her hands shaking slightly. She was the ship's communication officer, and she had been working hard to build good relationships with their new alien allies. The last thing anyone wanted was to mess up the peace talks. "Those energy weapons are incredible," whispered Dr. Amy Rodriguez, the ship's doctor and scientist. "The power readings are off the charts. One hit from those things could probably cut a man in half." Jake nodded, but said nothing. He had read all the reports about Zephyrian technology. Their weapons were centuries ahead of anything humans had ever made. Their armor could stop bullets, energy blasts, and even small explosions. Their ships could travel faster than light, and their computers were so advanced, they seemed almost magical dots, so why did he feel like something was missing? The Zephyrians had joined the Galactic Alliance just 3 months ago. They brought with them technology that made human inventions look like stone tools. Their medical equipment could heal wounds in minutes. Their engines were so efficient they barely used any fuel. Their communication systems could send messages across the galaxy in seconds, but Jake had been a soldier for 20 years, and he had learned to trust his instincts. Something about the way these aliens fought bothered him. They were skilled, no doubt about that, but they relied too much on their technology. They moved like they expected their armor to protect them no matter what. They swung their weapons like they knew nothing could stand against them. Commander Zarathul finished her practice routine and turned toward the group of humans. Her helmet retracted, showing a face that was both beautiful and frightening. Her skin was pale blue, her eyes were large and golden, and her mouth had small teeth that looked sharp enough to bite through metal. When she smiled, it was not exactly friendly. "So these are the famous humans," she said, her voice carrying a metallic sound that made it hard to understand. "The species that somehow managed to survive on a death world without any real technology." Jake felt Lisa tense up beside him. The lieutenant was good at her job, but she was not used to dealing with aliens who liked to insult people. The Zephyrians were warriors, and warriors often tested each other with harsh words before they tested each other with weapons. "We are honored to meet you, Commander," Lisa said, using the formal greeting they had practiced. "We look forward to learning from your expertise." Zarathul's golden eyes moved across the group of humans, studying each one like a scientist looking at the bugs under a microscope. When her gaze reached Jake, she stopped and stared at his waist. The human captain was wearing his dress uniform, complete with the ceremonial sword that had been passed down through his family for generations. "What is that?" she asked, pointing at Jake's weapon with one of her forearms. Jake looked down at his grandfather's cavalry saber. The leather scabbard was old and worn, but well cared for. The brass fittings were polished to a bright shine, and the steel blade inside was sharp enough to shave with. It was not much to look at compared to the energy weapons the aliens carried, but it had served the Morrison family well through 3 wars. "It is a sword?" Jake said simply. "My grandfather carried it in the war, and his grandfather before him." The other Zephyrian warriors had stopped their practice and were gathering around to listen. They looked at Jake's weapon with expressions that might have been curiosity or amusement. It was hard to tell with alien faces. "A sword?" Zarathul repeated, and now there was no mistaking the laughter in her voice. "Made of metal, that cuts with a sharp edge?" "Yes," Jake said, keeping his voice steady. He had dealt with bullies before, and he knew the best way to handle them was to stay calm and not give them the reaction they wanted. "How primitive," one of the other aliens said, speaking in their musical language. Jake's translation device turned the words into English, but it could not hide the mockery in the speaker's tone. "It is like something from a museum," another warrior added. "Do humans still fight with sticks and stones as well?" Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward, her scientist's mind already working on an explanation. Actually, metal weapons were quite advanced for their time. The forging techniques required to make a good sword were very sophisticated, and the metallurgy involved years of development and refinement. "Compared to what?" Zarathul asked, raising one of her energy blades. The weapon hummed with power, and the air around it shimmered with heat. "This can cut through your ship's hull. It can slice through solid rock. It can destroy any armor your species has ever made. What can your little metal stick do?" Jake felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him. The other humans looked uncomfortable, worried that he might say something to offend their new allies. The Zephyrians looked amused, like adults watching a child play with toys. He thought about his grandfather, who had charged across the fields of France with that same sword in his hand. He thought about his great-grandfather, who had fought in the trenches of the First World War. He thought about all the men and women who had carried simple weapons into battle against impossible odds and somehow found a way to win. "It has kept my family alive," Jake said quietly. "That is enough for me." Commander Zarathul's expression changed slightly. For just a moment, she looked like she might be reconsidering her opinion of the human warrior. But then she shook her head and laughed. Again, a sound like wind chimes made of metal. "Perhaps you would like to show us how it works?" she asked, her voice carrying a challenge that everyone in the room could hear. "We are always interested in learning about primitive fighting techniques. It might be useful for historical research." The training deck became very quiet. Even the ship's engines seemed to hum more softly, as if the entire vessel was holding its breath. Jake looked around at the faces watching him, human and alien alike, and realized that this moment was about much more than just a simple demonstration. The Zephyrians were testing him, testing all of humanity. They wanted to see if the stories about human courage and determination were true, or if they were just myths told by a weak species trying to make themselves feel important. Jake's hand moved to the hilt of his sword, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon his family had carried for generations. He looked into Commander Zarathul's golden eyes and saw the same look he had seen in the eyes of every bully he had ever faced. "I would be honored to show you," he said, and drew his blade. The steel blade caught the light as Jake pulled it from its scabbard. The sword was about 3 feet long, with a slight curve that made it perfect for cutting. The metal was dark gray, polished smooth from years of care, and the edge gleamed like silver. Compared to the glowing energy weapons of the Zephyrians, it looked ancient and weak. Commander Zarathul watched Jake hold his weapon, and her forearms moved in what might have been alien laughter. The other Zephyrian warriors gathered closer, their golden eyes bright with curiosity. They had heard stories about human weapons, but seeing one up close was different. It was hard to believe that humans had conquered their own planet with such simple tools. "Show us how it works," Zarathul said, her metallic voice carrying across the training deck. "We are very interested in primitive combat techniques." Jake held the sword properly, the way his grandfather had taught him when he was just a boy. The grip felt comfortable in his hand, like shaking hands with an old friend. He had practiced with this weapon for 30 years, learning every balance point and every way it could move. "This blade has been in my family for over a century," Jake said, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "It was forged by human hands, using techniques passed down through generations." The steel is folded many times to make it strong and flexible. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward, her scientist's mind already working. The metallurgy is actually quite sophisticated, she explained to the aliens. The carbon content has to be exactly right, and the tempering process requires precise temperature control. Too hot and the steel becomes brittle. Too cool and it stays soft. One of the younger Zephyrian warriors made a clicking sound with his mouth. But it is still just metal, he said through the translation device. It cannot channel energy. It cannot cut through modern armor. It cannot even hurt us. That remains to be seen, Jake replied calmly. He moved through a simple practice form, the sword cutting through the air in smooth arcs. The movements were not flashy like the alien combat styles, but they were precise and controlled. Every motion had a purpose. Commander Zarathil watched Jake's demonstration with growing amusement. The human moved well for his species, but his weapon was laughably simple. Her own energy blades could slice through starship hull plating. They could cut through solid rock and metal like it was paper. They could destroy any armor that humans had ever made. Very impressive, she said, and her tone made it clear she did not mean it. But can your metal stick do this? She activated all 4 of her energy weapons at once. The blades hummed with power, glowing bright blue and purple. The air around them shimmered with heat, and small sparks danced along their edges. She moved through a complex combat form, her 4 arms working together in perfect coordination. The energy blades left trails of light in the air, creating patterns that looked almost like art. The demonstration was incredible. Zarathil moved like a dancer, spinning and jumping while her weapons cut through training dummies made of reinforced steel. The energy blades sliced through the metal targets without any resistance, leaving clean cuts that glowed red-hot. Pieces of destroyed training equipment scattered across the deck. When she finished, the training deck was silent except for the hum of cooling metal. The human crew members stared at the destruction with wide eyes. Even Jake had to admit that the display was impressive. The Zephyrian weapons were incredibly powerful, and their user was clearly skilled. Now you understand, Zarathil said, turning off her weapons. This is real combat technology. This is what advanced civilizations use when they fight. Your metal sword is a relic from a time when your species knew nothing about real warfare. Lieutenant Lisa Chung stepped forward, her diplomatic training taking over. We appreciate the demonstration, Commander. The technological capabilities of your people are truly remarkable. We have much to learn from you, but Zarathil was not finished. She looked at Jake with her golden eyes, and there was something like hunger in her expression. I have a proposal, she said. Let us have a proper demonstration. You with your ancient weapon, and me with modern technology. We will see which is truly superior. The suggestion sent a ripple of shock through the human crew. Dr. Rodriguez grabbed Jake's arm. You cannot be serious, she whispered. Those weapons could kill you instantly. 1 hit and you would be cut in half. We could adjust the power settings, Zarathil said, apparently hearing the doctor's concerns. Make it safe for training purposes. But the demonstration would still be valid. We would see if primitive human weapons can compete with advanced alien technology. Jake looked around the training deck at the faces watching him. The other humans looked worried and afraid. They knew he was a good soldier, but this was different. This was like asking a man with a knife to fight a tank. The Zephyrian warriors looked excited. They had heard stories about human courage and determination, but they had never seen it tested. Most of them believed the stories were exaggerated. How could a species with such primitive technology have survived their own planet's wars? There is more, Zarathil continued, and now her voice carried a formal tone that made everyone pay attention. If your weapon can damage my armor, even slightly, I will personally recommend that humans be included in our advanced combat training programs. You will learn to use real weapons, not toys from your primitive past. The offer was incredible. The Zephyrians were the best fighters in the known galaxy. Their combat training programs were legendary. Any human who learned their techniques would become a warrior beyond anything Earth had ever produced. And if I lose? Jake asked. Then you admit that human weapons are obsolete, Zarathil replied. You acknowledge that your species needs to abandon its primitive ways and learn from more advanced civilizations. Jake felt the weight of the decision. This was about more than just his pride or his family's sword. This was about humanity's place in the galaxy. If he failed, it would confirm what many aliens already believed about humans being a backward species that had gotten lucky. But if he succeeded, if he could somehow prove that human weapons and human skill could compete with alien technology, it would change everything. Other species would have to reconsider their opinions about humanity. The respect they gained could open doors to new opportunities and partnerships. "I accept," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the training deck. The Zephyrian warriors cheered in their musical language, the sound like wind chimes in a storm. The human crew members looked at each other with expressions of worry and disbelief. Lisa Chang started to protest, but Jake held up his hand to stop her. "This is my choice," he said. "And my responsibility." Admiral Karen Wright appeared at the edge of the training deck, having heard about the challenge from her crew. She was a tall woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been commanding ships for 20 years, and she knew when a situation was about to get out of hand. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority of command. "Are you certain about this course of action?" Jake looked at his superior officer and nodded. "Yes, Admiral. This is something I need to do." Wright studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, but I want medical teams standing by, and I want power limiters on all alien weapons. If this goes wrong, I do not want anyone getting killed over a training exercise." Zarathil activated her armor's defensive systems, and the crystalline plates began to glow with inner light. "Do not worry about me, Admiral. My armor can withstand direct hits from ship-mounted weapons. A primitive metal blade cannot possibly harm it." Jake drew his sword again and took his fighting stance. The blade felt heavier now, weighted with the expectations of his entire species. He thought about his grandfather, who had faced impossible odds with the same weapon. He thought about all the human soldiers who had fought against superior technology and somehow found a way to win. "Let us begin," he said. The training deck became a circle of watchers as Jake and Commander Zarathil faced each other in the center. The alien warrior stood 7 feet tall in her glowing armor, her 4 arms holding energy weapons that hummed with deadly power. Jake looked small beside her, just a human man with an old steel sword. Admiral Wright stood with the other humans at the edge of the circle. Her face was calm, but her hands were clenched into fists. Dr. Rodriguez had her medical scanner ready, watching Jake's vital signs on a small screen. Lieutenant Lisa Chang whispered a prayer in her native language, hoping that her friend would survive the next few minutes. The Zephyrian warriors made excited sounds in their musical voices. They had formed their own group on the opposite side of the circle, their golden eyes bright with anticipation. Most of them believed this would be over quickly. A primitive human weapon against advanced alien technology was not really a fair fight. "Remember," Admiral Wright called out, "this is a training exercise, no lethal force. Power limiters are active on all energy weapons." Zarathil's armor plates shifted color from silver to deep blue, showing her confidence. "The power limiters will not matter," she said. "My armor can absorb more energy than his weapon can deliver. This demonstration will prove that human technology is obsolete." Jake held his sword in a ready position, the blade angled down and to the right. It was a defensive stance, designed to let him react quickly to attacks from any direction. He had learned this position from his grandfather, who had learned it from his grandfather before him. The knowledge went back generations, passed down through years of real combat. "Begin," Admiral Wright commanded. Zarathil moved first, and her speed was incredible. Her 4 arms worked together like a deadly machine, energy blades slicing through the air in complex patterns. She attacked high and low at the same time, forcing Jake to defend against multiple strikes while trying to find an opening for his own attack. The human captain moved his sword in quick, precise motions. Steel rang against energy as he parried the alien's strikes. Sparks flew where the weapons met, and the air filled with the smell of ozone. Jake's blade moved so fast it was almost a blur, but he was clearly fighting just to stay alive. "Look at him struggle," one of the younger Zephyrian warriors said, his voice full of amusement. "He can barely keep up with Commander Zarathal's basic attacks." The observation was accurate. Jake was being pushed backward across the training deck, his swordwork limited to desperate defensive moves. Every time he tried to attack, Zarathal's superior reach and extra arms forced him back on defense. The alien warrior was playing with him, using only simple combinations that any Zephyrian child would know. Dr. Rodriguez watched her scanner with growing concern. Jake's heart rate was climbing rapidly, and his breathing was becoming labored. The physical strain of defending against 4 weapons at once was enormous, even for a trained soldier. "He cannot keep this up much longer," she whispered to Admiral Wright. "His body is not designed for this kind of combat." But Jake was not just defending randomly. Years of studying military history had taught him that every warrior, no matter how skilled, had patterns and weaknesses. He began to watch Zarathal's movements more carefully, looking for the small details that might give him an advantage. The alien commander was good, very good. Her 4 arms moved in perfect coordination, and her energy weapons could attack from angles that no human could manage. But Jake noticed something interesting. When she used her most complex attack combinations, there was a tiny delay in her lower left arm. It was just a fraction of a second, but it was there. He also noticed that Zarathal's attacks were becoming more elaborate. She was showing off for the other warriors, adding extra flourishes that looked impressive but were not really necessary. Her confidence was making her careless. "Is this the best humanity can offer?" Zarathal called out, her voice carrying easily over the sound of clashing weapons. "I expected more from the species that claims to be warriors." The taunt was designed to make Jake angry, to cause him to make mistakes. But the human captain had been in too many fights to fall for such an obvious trick. Instead, he used the moment when she was speaking to study her stance and balance. Zarathal's armor was incredibly advanced, but it was also heavy. The power systems that made it so effective also made it bulky. She moved with grace, but Jake could see that she was working harder than she appeared. The energy weapons were powerful, but they drew from the same power source as her armor's defensive systems. "You are slower than I expected," Jake said, his voice calm despite his heavy breathing. "For such advanced technology it does not seem very efficient." The comment hit home. Zarathal's golden eyes flashed with anger, and her attacks became more aggressive. She began using her flight capability, launching herself into the air to attack from above. Her energy weapons left glowing trails as she spun and dove, creating a light show that was beautiful and terrifying. Jake found himself fighting in 3 dimensions now, his swordwork adapted to defend against attacks from above as well as from the sides. He had to dive and roll to avoid the aerial strikes, and more than once he barely escaped being hit by the energy blades. The watching crowd was impressed by the display. The Zephyrian warriors cheered their commander's acrobatic attacks, while the humans watched with growing anxiety. It looked like Jake was completely outmatched, but the human captain was learning. Each exchange taught him something new about his opponent. He discovered that Zarathal's aerial attacks, while spectacular, followed predictable patterns. She always approached from the same angles, and she always landed in the same places. More importantly, he realized that the alien warrior's greatest strength was also her weakness. She was fighting like someone who had never faced a real challenge. Her movements were perfect for fighting other Zephyrians, but they were not adapted for fighting humans. Jake began to change his tactics. Instead of trying to match Zarathal's speed and complexity, he started fighting like a human. He used his lower center of gravity to his advantage, staying close to the ground where her aerial attacks were less effective. He started using moves that his grandfather had taught him, techniques developed for fighting on the battlefields of Earth. The change was subtle, but the more experienced watchers began to notice it. Admiral Wright leaned forward, her military training recognizing the shift in Jake's fighting style. He was no longer just defending, he was starting to dictate the pace of the battle. "Interesting," she murmured. "He is adapting to her fighting style faster than she is adapting to his." Zarathul noticed the change too, though she did not fully understand what was happening. The human was becoming more difficult to hit, and his counterattacks were coming at unexpected times. She increased the power of her weapons, pushing them to their maximum training settings. "Stand still and fight like a warrior," she commanded, frustrated by Jake's constant movement. "I am fighting like a warrior," Jake replied, dodging another aerial attack. "I am fighting like a human warrior." The distinction was important. Zephyrian combat was based on superior technology and overwhelming force. Human combat was based on adaptation, creativity, and the ability to find solutions where others saw only problems. Jake's sword work was becoming more confident now. He was no longer just trying to survive. He was starting to see possibilities. Small openings in Zarathul's defenses that might give him the chance he needed. The real fight was just beginning. The battle had been going on for 10 minutes, and Jake was starting to understand his opponent better. Commander Zarathul was skilled, fast, and powerful, but she had one major weakness. She had never fought someone who was truly desperate. Every battle she had ever won was because her technology was superior to her enemy's weapons. She had never faced an opponent who had to rely on pure skill and determination. Jake's breathing was heavy, and sweat dripped from his forehead. His uniform was torn in several places where the energy blades had come close to hitting him. But his eyes were sharp and focused, watching every movement that Zarathul made. He was no longer the same man who had started this fight. The combat had changed him, made him more dangerous. Dr. Rodriguez watched her scanner with worry. Jake's heart was beating very fast and his body temperature was rising. But there was something else she noticed. His movements were becoming more efficient, more controlled. He was using less energy for each defensive move, which meant he was learning to read his opponent's attacks better. "He is adapting," Admiral Wright said quietly, her experienced eyes seeing what the others missed. "Look at how he moves now compared to 5 minutes ago. He is not just defending anymore." The observation was correct. Jake had stopped trying to fight like a Zephyrian. Instead, he was fighting like a human who had studied warfare his entire life. His grandfather had taught him that the best warriors were not the ones with the strongest weapons, but the ones who could think fastest. Under pressure, Zarathul launched another aerial attack, spinning through the air with her 4 energy weapons, creating a wheel of deadly light. It was a move that had never failed her before. No enemy had ever survived this particular combination of strikes, but Jake was ready for it. He had seen this attack pattern 3 times already, and he had been preparing for this moment. Instead of diving away like he had done before, he stepped forward into the attack. His sword moved in a simple, clean arc that his great-grandfather would have recognized from the cavalry charges of old. Earth. The steel blade caught one of Zarathul's energy weapons at exactly the right moment, when all her weight was committed to the spinning attack. The impact sent vibrations through both weapons, and for just a second, the alien warrior's perfect coordination was broken. Jake did not waste the opportunity. He followed up with a series of quick strikes that forced Zarathul to land awkwardly. For the first time in the battle, she looked uncertain. Her golden eyes showed confusion as she tried to understand what had just happened. "Impossible," she said, her metallic voice carrying a note of disbelief. "You should not have been able to counter that attack." "Your attack was perfect," Jake replied, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "But it was perfectly predictable. You have used the same pattern every time you go airborne." The comment stung because it was true. Zarathul realized that she had been fighting like she was in a demonstration rather than a real battle. Her moves were impressive, but they were also repetitive. She had never needed to vary her tactics before because her technology had always been overwhelming. The watching Zephyrian warriors were no longer cheering. They were starting to understand that their champion was not dominating this fight the way they had expected. The primitive human with his simple metal weapon was proving to be more challenging than anyone had predicted. "He is actually holding his own," one of them said, his voice full of surprise. "How is this possible?" The older Zephyrian warriors were quiet, their experienced eyes seeing something that the younger ones missed. The human was not just surviving. He was learning, and adapting faster than any warrior they had ever seen. Every exchange was teaching him something new about their fighting style. Jake pressed his advantage, attacking with a series of moves that came from human military traditions. He used techniques that had been developed for fighting on the battlefields of Earth, where soldiers had to face superior technology with courage and skill. His sword work was simple but effective, each strike aimed at exploiting the weaknesses he had discovered in Zarathal's defense. The alien commander was forced to use more energy to defend herself. Her armor's power systems were working harder now, and Jake could see small indicators on her chest plate showing that her energy reserves were being drained. The realization gave him new hope. "Your armor is very impressive," Jake said as he continued his attack. "But it uses a lot of power, does it not?" Zarathal's response was to activate her armor's full defensive systems. Energy shields flickered around her body, and her weapons increased their power output. She was no longer holding back, no longer treating this as a simple demonstration. The human had forced her to fight seriously, but the increase in power came at a cost. Jake could see the strain on her face as the armor systems drew more energy from her body. Zephyrian technology was advanced, but it was not unlimited. Every defensive shield and every energy weapon had to be powered by something. Jake changed his tactics again, this time using his knowledge of human endurance training. He began to fight a war of attrition, forcing Zarathal to use her energy weapons at maximum power while he conserved his own strength. His sword required no power source except his own muscles and determination. The alien warrior realized what was happening, but it was too late to change her strategy. She had committed to fighting with full power, and now she had to maintain that level or risk being overwhelmed by Jake's increasingly confident attacks. "You are trying to tire me out," she said, her voice showing the first signs of strain. "This is a coward's tactic?" "This is a survivor's tactic," Jake corrected. "My grandfather taught me that the warrior who is still standing at the end of the battle is the one who wins." The exchange continued for several more minutes, with Jake using every trick he had learned in 30 years of military service. He fought like a man who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. His sword work became more aggressive, more creative, combining techniques from different fighting traditions to create combinations that Zarathal had never seen before. The alien commander was struggling now. Her energy weapons were powerful, but they were also draining her armor's power reserves at an alarming rate. The defensive systems that had seemed so invincible at the start of the battle were now working against her, using energy that she needed for her attacks. Jake saw his moment coming. Zarathal was preparing for another one of her complex combination attacks, the kind that had been so effective earlier in the battle. But now Jake knew exactly what she was going to do, and he was ready for it. The alien warrior raised all four of her weapons, energy crackling along their edges. She was going to use her most powerful attack, the one that was guaranteed to end the fight. Every system in her armor redirected power to her weapons, leaving her momentarily vulnerable. Jake had been waiting for exactly this moment. He had studied Zarathal's fighting patterns, learned her weaknesses, and prepared for this one opportunity. Everything depended on the next few seconds. The energy weapons began to move in their deadly pattern, and Jake stepped forward to meet them. His grandfather's sword moved in a simple, perfect arc that carried with it the weight of human history and the determination of a species that had never learned to give up. The steel blade found its target. The steel blade slid into the gap between Zarathal's shoulder armor and chest plate with a soft whisper of metal on metal. Jake's grandfather's sword, forged over a century ago in the fires of Earth, found the one weakness that advanced alien engineering had failed to protect. The blade went in just an inch, but it was enough. Sparks exploded from the junction point where the armor pieces met. The energy discharge lit up the training deck like a miniature lightning storm. Zarathal's four weapons suddenly went silent, their deadly hum fading to nothing. The glowing energy blades flickered and died as power was cut from the damaged systems. Commander Zarathal stood frozen in the center of the training deck, her golden eyes wide with shock. Her armor, which had been designed to withstand direct hits from starship weapons, had been penetrated by a primitive human sword. The reality of what had just happened was too big for her mind to accept immediately. The watching crowd was completely silent. The Zephyrian warriors stared at their champion, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The human crew members looked just as stunned, though their shock was mixed with growing pride and amazement. Jake stepped back and lowered his sword, breathing heavily from the effort of the long battle. His uniform was soaked with sweat, and his arms ached from the strain of fighting against 4 energy weapons at once. But his eyes were calm and steady as he looked at his defeated opponent. "Your armor is very impressive, Commander," he said, his voice respectful despite his victory. "It took everything I had to find that one small weakness." Zarathil slowly reached up and touched the spot where Jake's sword had penetrated her armor. Her fingers came away with small drops of blue, liquid that might have been alien blood. The wound was not serious, but it was real. A primitive human weapon had done what her own people's most advanced technology could not do. "How?" she asked, her metallic voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know where to strike?" Jake sheathed his sword with the same careful motion he had used thousands of times before. "Every system has weaknesses," he said simply. "My grandfather taught me that the best warriors are not the ones with the strongest weapons, but the ones who can think clearly under pressure." Admiral Wright stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral despite the pride she felt for her subordinate. The political implications of this moment would be discussed in government buildings across the galaxy for years to come. A human had just defeated one of the most advanced warriors in known space using nothing but skill and determination. "An impressive demonstration," Wright said diplomatically. "I believe both sides have learned something valuable today." Dr. Rodriguez was already moving toward Jake with her medical scanner, checking for injuries that might not be obvious. The human captain was exhausted and dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. His vital signs were returning to normal, though his adrenaline levels were still high. "You need to rest," she told him quietly. "That fight took more out of you than you realize." But Jake was not looking at the doctor. His attention was focused on Commander Zarathil, who was still standing in the center of the training deck like a statue. Her armor was slowly powering down, the glowing plates fading to dull metal. The proud warrior who had begun this demonstration was gone, replaced by someone who was questioning everything she had believed about combat and technology, the other. Zephyrian warriors approached their commander slowly, their earlier excitement replaced by confusion and concern. They had never seen Zarathil defeated before, and they did not know how to react to what had just happened. "Commander," one of them said in their musical language, "are you injured?" Zarathil looked at her subordinate as if seeing him for the first time. "No," she said slowly. "I am not injured, but I am changed." She turned to face Jake, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone. The arrogance and mockery were gone, replaced by something that sounded like respect. "You have proven me wrong, Captain Morrison," she said, using his proper rank for the first time. "I believed that advanced technology was always superior to primitive weapons. I was mistaken." Jake inclined his head politely. "Your technology is impressive, Commander. But technology is only as good as the warrior who uses it. You fought with skill and honor." "But I fought with pride," Zarathil replied, "and pride made me careless. I underestimated you because your weapon looked simple. I forgot that simple does not mean weak." The admission sent ripples of shock through the watching Zephyrian warriors. Their commander was acknowledging that she had been defeated by a primitive human weapon. Some of them looked angry, others confused, but the older warriors were nodding slowly in understanding. "What happens now?" Lieutenant Lisa Chung asked, her diplomatic instincts making her worry about the consequences of Jake's victory. Zarathil began removing her damaged armor, piece by piece. Without the bulky protective plating, she looked smaller and more vulnerable. But her golden eyes were bright with new understanding. "Now I keep my promise," she said. "Captain Morrison has proven that human weapons and human skill deserve respect. I will personally recommend that humans be included in our advanced combat training programs. The offer was more valuable than gold. The Zephyrian combat training programs were legendary throughout the galaxy. Any human who learned their techniques would become a warrior beyond anything Earth had ever produced. But more than that, Zarathil continued, I want to learn from you. Your fighting style, your ability to adapt and overcome superior technology. These are skills that my people need to understand. Jake looked surprised by the request. You want me to teach you? I want you to teach all of us, Zarathil said, gesturing to the other Zephyrian warriors. We have become too dependent on our technology. We have forgotten that the mind of the warrior is more important than the weapons in his hands. Engineer Pete Campbell, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward with a grin on his face. I hate to interrupt this historic moment, he said, but I think there are some people back on Earth who are going to want to hear about this. Admiral Wright smiled for the first time since the demonstration had begun. Indeed, this story will be told in military academies for generations to come. But Jake was thinking about something else. He looked at his grandfather's sword, still sharp and ready despite the battle it had just won. The blade had been forged by human hands using techniques that were centuries old. It had been carried by men who faced impossible odds and found a way to win. Commander, he said to Zarathil, I would be honored to share what I know about human combat techniques. But I have one condition. Name it, she replied. I want to learn about your technology as well. Not to replace human weapons, but to understand how they work. The best warriors use every advantage they can find. Zarathil's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. Agreed, we will learn from each other. Dr. Rodriguez finished her medical scan and put away her equipment. This is unprecedented, she said to Admiral Wright. A cultural exchange based on mutual respect rather than one side teaching the other. It could change everything. Navigator Helen Torres, who had been quietly recording the entire demonstration, looked up from her equipment. The news networks are going to go crazy when they hear about this. A human defeating an alien warrior with an antique sword? It sounds like something from a fairy tale. But Jake knew it was not a fairy tale. It was proof that humanity had something valuable to contribute to the galaxy. Advanced technology was impressive, but it was not everything. Sometimes the oldest solutions were still the best ones. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake found himself standing alone with Commander Zarathil. The alien warrior was looking at his sword with new eyes, seeing it not as a primitive relic, but as a tool that had been perfected through centuries of use. Your grandfather would be proud, she said quietly. Jake touched the hilt of the sword and nodded. He taught me that a weapon is only as good as the warrior who carries it. Today I finally understood what he meant. The demonstration was over, but the real learning was just beginning.